Thanks for that. And just can I say about being election ready and bias? Now, members of your board have been quite controversial in the past and accused of being partial, politically partial. Mr. Robbie Gibb springs to mind, just given another 4-year term on your board.
After leaving 10 Downing Street, he joins BBC as a key director. He is also the owner of Jewish Chronicle. Yes. And he bought Jewish Chronicle with the help of several people. One of them is a guy called John Weir. Now, who is John Weir? John Weir is the guy who frequently presents Panorama, particularly Panorama related to exposing Labour Party's anti-Semitism or exposing the secret financial network of Hamas.
Right, Reform UK kicked off their campaign, promising to stand in almost all constituencies across the country. Their leader, as you know, is Richard Tice. Hello to you. And let's start by asking you about Nigel Farage, because he went to bed last night saying he was going to think about whether he would stand for reform. He woke up this morning and said he'd rather campaign for Donald Trump. What went wrong?
Even more importantly, I will never forget that I'm a Liverpool supporter.
Hello, my name is Rifat Jawaid. I've been a journalist for more than 25 years, with 12 years spent in the BBC across divisions at a fairly senior level. Now I run Janta Ka Reporter, which loosely translates as People's Reporter, because we believe that today most of the mainstream media, they either serve the interest of corporate class or politicians or political parties. And there is a need for a media platform to be serving the interests of common people, hence People's Reporter. Let's talk about a big story today. What is that big story? That story relates to general election being announced in this country, in United Kingdom. So what happened on Wednesday? On Wednesday, immediately after the PMQ, Prime Minister Questions, Rishi Sunak announced July the 4th as the new date for the next parliamentary election. Now, as soon as the election was announced, every single media platform swung into action with its live coverage. Not to be left far behind was the BBC, which is funded by your money, by my money, and a lot of money. We pay £160 every year, even during the time of cost of living crisis. We have been made to pay that amount of money to the BBC. And why that is important? That is important because of the development that I am going to talk about in this video. So I urge you to please do not sit idle, do not be a mute spectator, and share this video far and wide. Because that shows a very, very dangerous trend. And I must make it clear, I have never been associated with any political party. And I am not associated with any political outfit even now. So do not question my intention here. The intention is only to highlight the shortcomings of the mainstream media, and it really pains me when I see those shortcomings, either deliberate or inadvertent, in an organization which I proudly, I have always, in 2 TEDx talks that I have given in the past, and in both the TEDx talks I have highlighted, I have spoken very highly of my time in the BBC. So it pains me to see the BBC, the same organization, being taken for a ride. So BBC also swung into action. It launched a live website, live page on its news website, where it was capturing the key developments of that day. Now you would think that they were only focusing on the main political parties, or they were being equitable, they were being fair in its coverage. Wrong. Not just were they talking about the Labour Party and the Tory Party and the Lib Dems and the Greens, who rightly so should be talked about because of their recent performances and because of their pedigree of being the 4 key political parties. The BBC stunned me by giving undue coverage to a guy called Richard Tice. Now you know Richard Tice, the guy behind launching Reform Party. Now Reform Party is a newbie, has no previous history of any electoral successes. The only electoral performance that we can look back of Reform Party is their performance in the just concluded local body elections, where they won just 2 councillor seats. Just 2. Despite their media hypes, despite the media support that the guy received, Reform Party managed to win only 2 councillor seats. And yet, on the day Rishi Sunak announces the date for the new parliamentary election, the guy is given undue coverage on the BBC, and I'll tell you how. So the first, BBC carries a full quote of Richard Tice about him being battle ready for the elections. Now you would think that, oh, the BBC may have been slightly generous in terms of promoting the newbie. So did it promote George Galloway's Workers' Party? Unlike Reform Party, George Galloway's party has an MP. And in the same local body elections where Reform Party won just 2 seats, George Galloway's party won 4 seats across 3 local bodies. And one of George Galloway's candidates, even defeated the deputy leader of Manchester City Council. That's how stunning their performance was. Yet, George Galloway was nowhere in the BBC's coverage on the same day. What would you call it? And why? Because George Galloway has been speaking in favor of Palestinians. And I'll come to that point. Richard Tice's quote being highlighted on BBC. It's still there on the page. You can see the screen. I've taken the screenshot. It's still there on the BBC page. BBC thought it was important to highlight what Richard Tice had to say. What the leader of a party who has had no previous performance to showcase. And yet he needed to be given the equal platform along with the big 3-4 political parties. Then there is a guy called Nick Eardley, who is a BBC correspondent. He writes his own brief analysis about what he thinks about these elections. And then even in his analysis he thinks it's worth mentioning Reform Party to say how Reform Party would be eating into Conservative Party's the vote share. So this is what he writes. Nick Eardley, BBC's political correspondent. And his title of his analysis is "A Lot of Battles in 6 Weeks Ahead." And he goes on to talk about Rishi Sunak and every other party. And his second last sentence says, can Reform take Conservative votes? Can the Greens cause problems for Labour? So he thinks it's worth talking about Reform Party. It's worth talking about Greens, but not Workers' Party. Now there is no credible example yet to show that Reform will indeed become an alternative to Conservative. But there is a credible example, and there are lots of credible examples to showcase that George Galloway's Workers' Party are on course to become alternative to Labour Party. In fact, he talks about being an alternative to Labour Party. And yet, the BBC's Nick Eardley doesn't think that should be mentioned. If you are a public sector platform, if you are a public platform funded by people, wouldn't you represent the sentiments of what people think? Or would you just ignore it because their ideologies don't align with your agenda? BBC didn't stop here on that day. While concluding the live coverage, BBC sums up key election moments to watch out for tomorrow. In that, what BBC says, it talks about the election activities of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, but it also talks about the election activity of Reform Party. And he says, former UKIP leader Nigel Farage has told GB News he will make a decision on whether or not he will stand for Reform UK after thinking about it overnight. The BBC thinks that what Nigel Farage has to say of Reform Party has to be given the equal platform or equal coverage as that of the leaders of the big political parties. But what George Galloway has to say, and he has plenty of things to say every day, BBC doesn't think that needs to be covered. And this is an organization which is funded by your money and my money. And that's the reason why I was explaining that in the beginning of this video. Is that deliberate? Or is that inadvertent? And BBC doesn't end here. Only few days later, this Thursday, Victoria Derbyshire, who I have held in a high regard, but I was disappointed by her action. She invited Richard Tice on her show Newsnight.
Right, Reform UK kicked off their campaign, promising to stand in almost all constituencies across the country. Their leader, as you know, is Richard Tice. Hello to you. And let's start by asking you about Nigel Farage, because he went to bed last night saying he was going to think about whether he would stand for reform. He woke up this morning and said he'd rather campaign for Donald Trump. What went wrong?
Even more importantly, I will never forget that I'm a Liverpool supporter. Yeah.
OK, thank you very much, Richard
Great
Tice.
pleasure, nice to see you.
Leader of Reform UK.
To be given a platform for 6 minutes on Newsnight, on a channel on BBC Two, which has millions of viewers, is an undue advantage to Reform Party. Now, BBC must explain whether it has plans to invite George Galloway and give him equal time. That BBC must explain. Now, is it just a case in isolation, or there is a history? You have to look at the BBC management and the hierarchy. One of the key directors of BBC is a guy called Robbie Gibb. Now, who is Robbie Gibb? After leaving 10 Downing Street, he joins BBC as a key director. He is also the owner of Jewish Chronicle. Yes. And he bought Jewish Chronicle with the help of several people. One of them is a guy called John Weir. Now, who is John Weir? John Weir is the guy who frequently presents Panorama, particularly Panorama related to exposing Labour Party's anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn, or exposing the secret financial network of Hamas.
What was his response?
We never got any answers. Never. Never.
Yes, he did that. So he was the guy who presented Panorama, infamous, controversial Panorama, claiming anti-Semitism was on the rise in Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. Yes. And then fast forward in February this year, when Israelis had killed more than 30,000 innocent, unarmed Palestinians. You know what was BBC's priority? BBC's priority was to commission a program with this guy, John Weir, as a presenter, to investigate the secret finance being provided to Hamas. Yes, that was BBC's priority. Now, it's not a surprise why John Weir often is branded as BBC's Islamophobe in chief and a far-right journalist on social media. More recently, BBC's Director General Tim Davie had to appear before a select committee, and the questionable role of Robbie Gibb came under scrutiny.
Thanks for that. And just can I say about being election ready and bias? Now, members of your board have been quite controversial in the past and accused of being partial, politically partial. Mr. Robbie Gibb springs to mind, just given another 4-year term on your board. Is there a set of guidelines for members of the board over impartiality during a general election to ensure that there's no interference, no attempt to? It just seems strange. If you remember, one of the accusations was that he went and berated members of the Newsnight team, during an election period, that wouldn't be appropriate, would it? So, is there a set of guidelines there so that these people remain impartial?
Well, our guidelines apply to output. So what we're focused on is making sure that everything that we do.
Well, isn't he trying to influence output?
Well, first of all, he was invited to Newsnight, and I think berated is
Well,
probably not quite.
We can argue about that.
There's not an argument. It's just true that he was invited. But the berated, I think, is a choice of word which perhaps not everybody would use. He had a discussion with them about the delivery of Newsnight, the delivery of Impartiality. There is a code of conduct which applies to all non-executive directors of on the board.
Forgive me, but is that his role?
What is wrong?
To go down there and talk to them about delivering? Is that what he's on the board for?
No, but there isn't anything in the way in which the board is constructed as a unitary board which says that members of the board or non-executive directors of the board can't speak to programmes if programmes wish them to speak to them. There's nothing that says that. So it's not an offence against the governance of the BBC to do that. Of course, you then might judge what the conversation was about and so on and so forth. I wasn't there. But that's not in principle an offence against the governance of the BBC with a unitary board.
I'll go back to my original question, though. Is there some guidance for them during a period of a general election where it's
there's a clear code of conduct. There is not specific guidelines for in answer directly to your question, we don't specifically say during an election, because I think this is ongoing in terms of the pressures on board members and within the BBC. I think we're ferociously clear on it. There's a lot of noise around it. If any of you are appointed to the board a board position on the BBC, you are overseeing the executive. You hold us to account in delivering the editorial guidelines. The idea that you couldn't go and visit a programme is ridiculous, or not have an opinion. But I think the editors, again, and Deborah Turness running news, are very clear that we're editorial independent. We are accountable to the board in terms of delivery on the editorial guidelines, and we're the ones making the editorial decisions. And I think we're strong enough to do that. I mean, there'll be loads of, as we know, we've had it. I think mercifully the BBC board is constructed in a way that is different to some of the other public service broadcasters, by the way, that have far more political influence, by the way.
Now, what does BBC guidelines says? BBC has an editorial guidelines book, perhaps the only organisation which has a book which we have always been proud of. On the election coverage thing, it says, to achieve due impartiality, each bulletin, programme or programme strand, as well as online and interactive services, must ensure in covering the elections that the parties and, where relevant, independent candidates are covered proportionately over an appropriate period. Now, the BBC must be asked whether this was ensured on the day the election was announced on its website. No, it wasn't. Unless you can prove me wrong. It goes on to say, determining appropriate levels of coverage should take into account levels of past and current electoral support, and Ofcom's Digest published 28 February 2024. So past performance is key, right? Now, what is the past performance we have to look back? The performance in the local body elections. Now, who performed better? George Galloway's party or Richard Tice's party? George Galloway's party. So why are we not giving coverage to George Galloway's party on the BBC, but we are obsessed with giving undue coverage to Richard Tice? You are the organisation which is funded by our money. Now, somebody drew Galloway's attention to these unfair practices by the BBC and other media outlets, to which poor George Galloway could only say grotesque. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.